called Massachusetts versus EPA. It was an outrageous decision. The judicial activists on the court, 5 of them, it's a 5-4 decision, violated the Clean Air Act. They rewrote it. And even the nature of the case, the way it came to be, was a setup from day one. Massachusetts sued the Bush EPA to try and force the EPA to expand the meaning of the Clean Air Act and to redefine it, to rewrite it. Because you had a liberal activist attorney general, and other states did it, particularly in New England, claiming, well, all these other states, their pollution comes into our state and so forth and so on. But the push was on global warming, greenhouse gases. Now, I want to remind you, because it's important, greenhouse gases are not pollutants. The biggest part of greenhouse gases is water vapor. Water vapor is not a pollutant. Carbon dioxide, while it's given off by combustion engines and so forth, it's also given off by you every time you exhale. It's plant food. Now, you know that. Through photosynthesis and so forth, it creates oxygen. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, the planet would be an ice cube or an ice ball, whatever you want to say. It's a crucial part of our atmosphere. And I've talked about this before. If you drive across country, even part of a country, many of you may have seen these glass houses, green houses. And the reason for these greenhouses, in the dead of winter, in the colder areas of our country, people wanted to grow plants, they wanted to grow vegetables and so forth, and you would do it in these greenhouses. So you recreate this greenhouse gas effect. And you could see the windows, during the winter time, you see the condensation, that's water vapor. There's carbon dioxide in there, and on and on and on. So greenhouse gases are not pollutants. Carbon dioxide is not carbon monoxide, which is a pollutant and will kill you. If you put your mouth on your exhaust pipe, for instance, you won't have long to live. But that's not carbon dioxide, that's carbon monoxide. And I think the red movement, known as the green movement in this country, the enviro-statists, they've done a good job of confusing people about carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, and so have the media. So we have this decision from the Supreme Court, Massachusetts versus the EPA, and basically they took carbon dioxide, which never before in the scientific world, never before by our Environmental Protection Agency under either party, has held that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. But in order to regulate it under the Clean Air Act, it has to be a pollutant. So what the Supreme Court did is essentially say all airborne compounds, of whatever stripe would qualify as physical, chemical substances or matter which are emitted into or otherwise enter the ambient air. So they're not going to break it down into particles. The particles together, the elements together, may be regulated. They didn't compel it. They said may be regulated by the EPA. Well, of course, the EPA went nuts. Because the EPA, as well as our college campuses for the most part, is one of the last holdouts of the Stalinist left. Now, after the break, you've got that foundation built that many of you may not have known about before. I'm going to explain what happened today based on that case several years ago. We'll be right back.
Some hosts talk about the news, Mark Levin influences the news. Call the Mark Levin Show now at 877-381-3811.
So we had this decision by the Supreme Court several years ago. It's really a bastardization of the law called Massachusetts versus EPA, 5-4 decision. John Paul Stevens writes it. And, of course, the older he got, the more whacked out he got. Empowering the EPA to do something the Clean Air Act does not empower the EPA to do, and that is to regulate non-polluting substances, including carbon dioxide, and theoretically including water vapor. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, the statute itself provides a threshold. A threshold. So if a pollutant meets the threshold, then the EPA can regulate it. In fact, if it's a pollutant, it must regulate it. But the Supreme Court said when it comes to greenhouse gases, it may regulate it. Well, the problem is if they start regulating carbon dioxide before they even get to water vapor or the rest, which really they can't even figure out how to regulate, there's too much. As Justice Scalia wrote in his dissent footnote number 2 in that Massachusetts versus EPA decision of 2007, he said it follows that everything airborne from frisbees to flatulence qualifies as an air pollutant. So now that the EPA got its way in a 5-4 decision that it may regulate anything and everything in the air, even non-pollutants. Well, now they want to regulate carbon dioxide in the worst possible way. But they don't have any conceivable way of regulating everything. That is, how you breathe, and take it from there. I mean, virtually everything creates or consume some aspect of greenhouse gases, right? So they got an idea over there at the EPA under the Obama administration. Let's change the Clean Air Act by regulation. Let's change the 1970 Clean Air Act by regulation. We'll change the threshold. It's just too big. I know this seems counterintuitive, but They can't get their hands around it, and they don't want to tick off everybody. We got to figure out. We really want to go after these big businesses, the real polluters who create greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide. So we'll change the threshold. We'll just change it. And so they changed it. Well, there's a problem with that. It's called separation of powers. They're not allowed to rewrite statutes. I know this is a shock in modern-day Obamaville, but they're not allowed to do that. Only Congress can write statutes, and the EPA cannot, by regulation, alter the specific language and thresholds in a statute. If Congress wishes to do it, then Congress can do it. And so Justice Scalia said no. And he was joined by 4 others: Alito, Thomas, Kennedy, and Roberts. He said, we conclude the EPA's rewriting of the statute thresholds was impermissible and therefore could not validate the agency's interpretation of the triggering provisions. An agency has no power to tailor legislation to bureaucratic policy goals by rewriting unambiguous statutory terms. Do you realize that only got 5 votes? 4 justices, for the most part, voted the other way. 4 justices, in essence, voted against separation of powers. 4 justices, in essence, voted in favor of bureaucrats substituting their will for members of Congress. I mean, if Congress wants to change this, there's a process for that. The executive branch is not a lawmaking body that can make laws via regulation, rule, or fiat that usurps Congress's power. Now, what's amazing about this, folks, is this is one of the few times any federal court has pulled back on the excessive lawmaking powers of the executive branch. I mean, I've made the point in the Liberty Amendments that we have this non-delegation notion that Congress cannot delegate lawmaking powers to other entities, or it is a complete ruination of the notion of the consent of the governed. It's a complete rewrite of Article 1. But since the New Deal, when FDR tried to pack the court, obviously that has changed a lot, or we wouldn't have had a New Deal. And the courts have almost gone along every single time. I'd say 98% of the cases get thrown out, or the government's position is upheld. So in that sense, it's very rare, a 5-4 decision. Now that said, EPA still has enormous regulatory powers beyond this, or apart from this. And that also said, there were 2 justices who got it even more correctly than Antonin Scalia, in my humble opinion. Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas. Because by a 7-2 vote, those men said, we really should revisit the Massachusetts versus EPA decision because that was incorrectly decided. But it was only the 2 of them who voted for that. 7-2. Those men, Alito and Thomas, were absolutely correct. But it's apparent that they couldn't get 5 votes to do that anyway. The point is, folks, we have 4 justices on the Supreme Court who reject this notion of separation of powers, who believe in a massive authoritarian executive branch, who do not see distinct lines, separation of powers. At times they can be ambiguous, but they certainly weren't ambiguous here. And I'm telling you all this so you understand the decision, because none of the reporting has been very helpful. And of course, I and Landmark Legal Foundation were involved in this decision. We were asked to file an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, as we did, and several of our arguments, among others, were embraced by the majority. This is why I don't give that up, because it's very, very important in my view to not only talk about these things, but to do something about them. And I know the other hosts wax on and on and on about, look, I'm just a radio host. Well, I'm not just a radio host. Although I love it, and I'm blessed to do it, and it's the 3rd biggest program in America, and anybody who says differently is lying, but it's true. And it's the most successful program on the network that I'm involved with, Cumulus and Westwood One. But there are other things, too, that need to